Okay, today we have a special guest on the Shared Practices podcast. And I would have to say that I think one of the funnest part of this podcast has been to get to know people you kind of like idolize, or you've read a bunch of their stuff on Dental Town or elsewhere. And so I was happy when you came on the show, you did this interview, and I feel like that was a little bit of that for you. So why don't you introduce our guest today?
Yeah, well, I think, I did this interview, just to let everyone know, I did this interview maybe one of my first or second interviews after joining Richard. And so we actually decided to hold off till the end of the season to air it because it's a good leader into season 3, I think. And so that was one of the reasons why. But Graham, so I think pre-podcast, I think I had 2 people that really influenced me the most in my development, and people that I asked a lot of questions and learned a lot from. And I think the first one was Hunter Smith, who you guys have heard plenty of on the podcast. And the second one is really Graham Dersley. And Graham is not somebody that has been on our podcast before, but he's somebody that I was part of his private practice on fire group for a long time. I still am. And I've learned a lot from Graham. And so I think he's just a really, really bright guy, and he has a lot to share. And so I was excited to have him on the podcast today.
Awesome. George, you've prepared something with this episode specifically for our audience. So tell us about that.
Well, when I initially had recorded this episode, I thought it would be really cool if I put Graham's unique perspective of being able to integrate a lot of different philosophies into a sample practice that's very typical for something I see. And so I created a sample practice and I sent it over to Graham, and that was the resource that we had used and talked about throughout the whole episode. So I think the episode makes sense with that practice. Now, something I've done recently, because I get a lot of practices to look at, I've been trying to streamline that process of me getting feedback back to people to both make it faster and to make it more efficient for me so that I can look at more practices. And
Sure.
so we created a report that's automated on my end so that I can create it very easily. And I thought it'd be cool if we shared that report with everybody today so they can download it and they can watch the episode with the report in hand and really go through the practice as Graham is going through it and see exactly what he's seeing. So that'll be the episode resource today, and I think it'll be really cool to see that applied to this specific episode.
So where should people look for that if they're trying to download it?
I got a link in the show notes for the report. Over here on the Facebook group, I always put the episode resource on the Facebook group to download.
Perfect. Another good reason to join the Facebook group.
Yep, and we'll go ahead and jump right to the interview with Graham
Awesome.
Dersley.
Here we go.
I have with me today Dr. Graham Dersley. Graham is very well known on Dental Town for his famous thread, Serial Practice Transitioner. Graham is a prosthodontist. He graduated and bought a practice, a small office, and then kind of grew it quite a bit, sold that, and then has since done 2 startups. I have known Graham since my first year of dental school. I joined his Practice on Fire mastermind as a student, and he's really been great for me in answering a lot of questions I've had, and he's really knowledgeable on both acquisitions, startups, and systems. So I really think he's the perfect guy for this season, and we're really excited to have him on. How you doing today, Graham?
Awesome, George. Thanks for having me here.
And do you want to go a little bit into your background? I might have missed some things.
I think you covered it pretty well. Did pros right out of dental school, did in Maryland, live in the suburbs of Maryland. My wife worked in doing foreign policy in D.C., so that's why we're here. And, just living the life now, enjoying being a dentist.
Great. And then one of your threads, I know you're kind of well known for your Serial Practice Transitioner thread, but really the one that I really liked was the one that you had linked at the beginning of that thread that was your first office, where you bought the smaller office. And was it 3 ops?
Yes, 3 ops. It was a professor at the dental school, so he practiced part-time. He was a prosthodontist, and he was moving into full-time teaching and was looking for someone to transition the office to. So I found out about it through the director of the prosthodontic program at the school and just talked to him. So the practice never went on the market or anything. We just kind of, had a handshake agreement, and I bought it from him.
That's awesome. And so then you bought that office, and then how long did you own it before you ended up selling it?
About 5 years.
Okay. And so today I want to kind of talk about that type of arrangement where you buy a practice, you go in there, and then you grew it. How much did that practice grow, like in terms of 5 times, 4 times your original collections?
Probably about 5 times. Yeah.
That's what I thought. I knew it was a lot. So for the episode today, we have an episode resource that we've included, and if you're on our email list, you should have already gotten it. And I'm just going to briefly go over the practice. Graham already has this information. So we're kind of go through a hypothetical situation where you bought a practice, your collections are about $620,000, you have about 61% overhead, and your staff is just a dental assistant, an office manager, and a hygienist. You kind of have average demographics, nothing fantastic. The office digital x-rays, and it's just an insurance PPO practice. Graham, are there any details on that sheet that you think are important for our exercise that I haven't mentioned?
On this sheet, one thing that strikes me here, I'm just kind of looking at production breakdown, revenue breakdown. You got a lot of details here, and it does look to me like a very common practice. Heavy on restorative. Looks like the doctor refers out endo and oral surgery. He's got 3 staff, very common. So yeah, I could see probably thousands of these practices change hands every year.
And that's kind of the whole point. Is I really wanted to just kind of create a practice that was very common, that is very realistic for one of our listeners to have acquired.
Yep, that's looks like it to me. Nothing's really standing out here as anything wild and crazy.
Okay, so Graham, now you've bought this practice. So kind of take us through your mind, and you've acquired it, and what are you going to do from here?
Okay, well, I guess part of this depends on the owner's vision, right? The new owner comes in, and in their mind, what is the ideal practice? Because I think starting with the end in mind is great. And where do we want to be in 5, 10 years? What is our, the pinnacle of our career? What does that look like? And so I think that's super important when you buy a practice to make sure that, a lot of times we're not buying a practice that's already in that condition. It's rare to find a perfect practice. And so being able to identify if you can take the practice from where you buy it to where you envision it, and then kind of visualizing that roadmap is super important. So like for me, my practice style is a little bit different than the average general dentist. And so I like to do a lot of implants, and, if I can do more like life-changing big-time dentistry, that's my favorite thing to do rather than, hopping around doing quadrants of fillings. And so for me, I'd be looking at whether I can start to introduce some of those procedures into the practice.
Okay, so is that something you would try to screen before you ended up acquiring the practice?
Oh, definitely, yeah. So I'd be looking at the population. I'd be looking at the age of the population and seeing if there's other practices around that are offering those unique services. That would be a big part of my analysis.
Okay, so then for you, you would be looking at an older population then, like 45 and up, or are you looking at 50 plus? What would the median age be?
Yeah, higher median age than average would be good. Now here you have a median age of 42, which that's probably not too bad. And I see a lot of places where the median age might be in the low 30s, for example. So, and you can look at the demographics chart and see how many thousand people are age 50 and up, for example. That's one thing I'd be looking at.
Okay, so for our listener who maybe doesn't have the experience, the clinical expertise that you have, how would that differ in your vision? Would that be something you kind of ahead of time you're aware of, and then you pick a different practice because of it?
So what I would say is, let's say someone is a fairly new dentist, right? Just graduate. Maybe let's say you've done a year residency and you're looking at buying a practice. You're pretty recently graduated. Depends on your vision for your career too. A lot of dentists who are listening to this podcast might have some pretty lofty goals, I would imagine, compared to the average dentist. So, maybe you decide eventually you want to learn how to do implants, or, eventually you want to become a cosmetic dentist, or, whatever that vision is, keep that in mind and make sure that that's going to be doable in this community, right? So if it's a real blue-collar farming community and you want to be a fancy cosmetic dentist, that's probably not a good fit, just as an example.
Absolutely. So I kind of took you off track. So we bought this practice, and what are your initial thoughts if you were a young dentist who maybe was looking to acquire clinical skills but didn't yet have them?
Mm-hmm. Well, this practice, it looks like a good starter practice to me because it looks like they do mainly, restorative production. So probably not a ton of procedures that you're going to have a lot of difficulty doing. For example, if I saw a practice that was doing 20% orthodontics, for a new grad that might be hard who doesn't already know how to do orthodontics. It'd be a big red flag and something you'd have to really deal with. So, here most dentists can probably come in and do most of the dentistry that this seller was doing, which is a real plus. And then over time, as you learn new procedures, introduce them.
And then on the non-clinical side, when you kind of enter this practice, what are some of the first things you're looking at in terms of the practice systems that you would immediately want to adjust?
So I would definitely look at, there's a few systems that are super important as far as making your practice run smoothly, right? So one of the top ones is your collections policy and your financial policy. Now, this practice in your thing here, you have a collection rate of 96%, which isn't terrible. I mean, they're not doing a terrible job. I've worked in offices that were below 90%, and they had major issues to deal with.
Wow.
Yeah, so you could probably bump that up a little bit, bump it up a few percent. 99, 100% is obviously better than 96. So I'd take a look at what they were doing and, see if we can introduce some improvements there. I'd also take a look at, maybe they're being too strict in some cases. And, if you're being too strict with your financial policy, that can affect your case acceptance. So maybe there's a way to be less strict, but also collect more money, depending on what they're doing.
So then you would introduce a new collection policy, and what would that collection policy, what would it look like?
Well, so in my practice, I like to be as flexible as I can with the patients while also making sure that we do collect the money. So what we do is we have, it's a policy that's very common, I'd say. It's taught by a lot of consultants, taught at Breakaway, for example, where we offer the patient a prepayment discount of 5%. They want to prepay for it, and this is for the whole treatment plan. If they can accept the whole treatment plan and prepay for it, then we'll give them a discount. And that's my favorite option for sure, because it means we're going to most likely complete that case. The other payment plan that we really favor is a in-house payment plan where automated on either their credit card or checking account, we will process on a monthly basis.
Okay.
So let's say and my system's a little more complicated because I do go out beyond, a lot of people like to go only 4 or 5 months. If it's a bigger case, I will extend it beyond that. And it just depends on exactly what we're doing. But sometimes I'll go out, if we're doing an implant case, oftentimes it's easy to go out 12 months because sometimes those cases take that long anyway.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. By the time you extract, graft, place the implant, restore it, you're kind of looking at that timeline anyway.
Yep. And so, with those, we like to get a down payment from the patient, and I tend to do around 30%. And then the rest of the payments can just be divided up on a monthly basis. So those are the two options that I really like to offer patients.
And then I know, so you have that first option is the prepayment, then you have the kind of automated payment option, and then some people will include a third option that's like a third-party financing. Mm-hmm. Do you also offer that, or are you just mainly looking at the two options if I'm a patient in your practice?
We do offer it, but we don't promote it. So on my form, it has the two options: the in-house payment plan or the prepayment option. And if someone has care credit and they want to use care credit, or if neither of the first two options work for the patient, sometimes we'll offer them care credit. But I think having fewer options actually helps them make a decision. At one point, I actually had 4 options on my sheet. And I think just it gets a little murky and confusing for people when they're seeing all these options. And that's when they start to say, well, let me take it home and talk to my spouse about it.
And did you find an increase in case acceptance when you went from 4 to 2, or maybe you went 4 to 3?
It's been fairly recent since we switched from 4 to 2, so I haven't really measured it. I can't tell you for sure that it's going to increase case acceptance, but my hunch is that it will.
Okay, so if you look at a practice and one of us is walking into an office that has 96% collections, where are we losing that 4%?
Okay, a lot of times that 4%, first thing I would look at is insurance payments, because a lot of times we'll give a certain estimate for insurance and then they end up paying less than we expect them to pay for some reason. This could be due to a waiting period. This could be due to a downgrade. A million different reasons in the fine print why they might pay less than just what the insurance breakdown gets that we get from them when we verify the insurance. And so it's one thing I would look at is, are they underestimating that number? And by how much are they underestimating that number? So that in a lot of cases, even if there is a shortfall there, that you're still covered.
So you would look at what are they presenting to the patient as their insurance portion? Exactly.
Yeah. So a lot of times, let's say the insurance on the verification says they cover 80% of basic restorative. In my practice, we reduce that down to 70% in the system. We enter 70% in the software so that it will protect us in case there's a downgrade or something like that.
Okay, do you find that in and of itself will lead to a bump in collections due to the fact that you would not be recollecting any $20 or whatever it is that the patient didn't pay?
Yes, that's a common cause for write-offs in a practice, and it's a common cause for arguments with the patient too. Nobody likes to get a surprise statement and then they start to say things like, well, you said it was only going to cost $200 and now you're asking me for an extra $100. And, they'll start to think, well, the insurance, what they paid seems like it should be enough, for the work they did. Why do they have to collect more? And so just a lot of issues when you have to go back to the patient and ask for money, whereas patients love to get refunds, right? So we're very timely with our refunds because I think if we're going to rig the system so that on average we're collecting more from the patient than, the breakdown says, that, I like to give them a refund within a couple weeks. So we just send them a check. And along with that check, we send a request for a review too. So that's a nice way to ask for something when they're feeling good about your practice.
That's a great time.
Yep. Yeah,
so
for sure.
We've established that we're going to increase our case acceptance I know we were talking about collections, but it seems like that case presentation that you've talked about with the payment options will increase your case acceptance. And then we're estimating insurance in a more appropriate way to increase our collection rate.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to look at is the number of statements I send to ask for more money compared to the number of refund checks that I send. And I don't really measure this that specifically, but just as a general concept, you should hopefully be around 10 to 1, 10 refunds for every statement that you have to send.
Oh, that's a great way to check yourself to see how you're doing.
Yeah, and if you're not close to that, if you're 1 to 1, then you need to underestimate more. So let's say you downgrade 80% to 70%, and you're still sending out a lot of statements, then bump it down to 65% and see what that does.
A word from our sponsor, Q Optics. One of the things that surprised me since Q Optics has sponsored our podcast is how many other people I've found that are already using Q Optics loops. Ironically, at my workplace, after a couple episodes, I looked around and I realized that 3 or 4 of the different doctors I already knew already had their loops. I asked them about it and they all loved them. They've all had similar stories of, I was forced to use this company in dental school, switched to these. I've loved them ever since. It's been a consistent pattern. So my challenge to you is if you're in a group setting, if you're in an area where you're working with other doctors and you see there's other loops lying around, take a peek. See if anyone's already using Q Optics. That way you can try them on, you can ask them their opinion, you can see if they think it's worth it. I think you'll be surprised by how many people are already using Q Optics that you know. If you can't decide if you'd rather have the 3.5X or the 4.5, schedule a no-pressure look at their product line by emailing sales@qoptics.com. Use the promo code SP16 for $100 off a pair of loops or $300 off a pair of loops and light combo. Q Optics, let's have a better look.
Okay. And so now, other than our collections policy, so we've kind of shored up our collections policy and the way we present treatment financially, what else are you looking at to change right away?
So, one thing I'm looking at here is on the overhead, you've got 9% supply costs.
I hope you'd mention that.
Yeah, that seems pretty high to me. A lot of consultants will tell you 5% should be a goal. Maybe your accountant tells you 5%. So I'd be looking at who they're buying supplies from. Maybe in this case, it's probably one of the big dealers like Henry Schein, and they haven't even asked for a discount on their supplies. And so it's an easy way to lower the cost by kind of shopping around, maybe joining a discount club or something like that. And you probably save thousands of dollars a year on that.
So then you're getting better prices on your supplies. Are you doing anything to control inventory, or are you just negotiating price?
Well, I'd look at what they do as far as the assist. If they have the assistant ordering it, for example, or maybe it was the doctor ordering it before, and are they ending up with expired products that they're throwing away? Then we'd have to be a lot more organized about not ordering too many things. But
that's not something you'd jump into right away. You'd be more interested in seeing what it would look like after you negotiate price.
Yeah, I mean, unit price to me is the most important thing, and versus monthly cash flow. Now, if I get a great deal, like for instance, Safeco oftentimes has these quarterly specials, and at the end of last year, they had a great price on gloves. They were like half off, and so I bought enough for the whole year. And so I had like half an operatory full of boxes of gloves.
Oh, wow.
And, I'm okay spending a lot. And so my December supply overhead looked terrible, right? I spent $3,000 on gloves. But this year, I'm going to spend nothing on gloves. So, overall, at the end of it, I'm going to come out way ahead. And so that's what I look at is I'm focused on unit price for things. So I'll buy in bulk where appropriate. Same with, they had this great special on hygiene prophy angles. And I bought like 4,000 prophy angles. And, my staff came to me and it's like, we didn't order this. They thought I was going to be mad that we had so many. And when they arrived, they wanted to let me know that they did not buy that many. And I told them, no, it's okay. Like, we got a great deal on them. So things like that, they don't expire, right? So you don't really have to worry about it. You'll use them up. But I'm much more careful about things like impression materials and anesthetics, things like that are going to expire.
Yeah, I was going to say perishable. That might not work as well.
Right.
So then so we've now shored up our supplies by negotiating for price. And so what else are you looking at when you walk into an office, or our new grad or a couple years out has walked into this office?
Mm-hmm. So the next thing I'm going to look at is where are our opportunities. So let's say your goals are to increase production. Right.
Okay.
Then I'd be looking at where our opportunities are for that. Now, some obvious things here are that they don't do any endo or oral surgery. And so maybe you want to take a CE course in endo, or maybe you already are comfortable doing endodontics. And so we'll be introducing those procedures into the practice. That's an easy way to increase production right there. And then I'd be looking at elective procedures. Doesn't look like this practice is doing many elective procedures.
Okay, so you'd be looking at the procedure mix as a way to increase your revenue as well, knowing that you can add procedures and then that'll lead to a bump in your production.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how would you approach scheduling?
Well, it depends on the system that they have right now. Coming in, the first month, you're probably just going to kind of go with the flow of things, kind of get to know the practice. Hopefully your staff is good and they can kind of help you to understand the way that they've been doing things all along. But if I saw opportunity for improving the schedule, then I would certainly coach the staff on how I prefer to have it done. Now, my ideal day is I like to kind of flow from one patient to the next without a lot of time wasted in between there. So if I can just go from one operatory 1 to operatory 2 and, the second patient's been prepped and ready to go, but yet they haven't had to wait for me for very long, maybe a couple minutes, that's my ideal. So one patient at a time, but kind of steady one to the next. So we kind of dovetail our appointments. We do a provider time scheduling where, if a patient is assistant-only time, we can put them in another operatory and not use up my time for it. So I'd introduce a system like that if they didn't have it already.
And then on the subject of provider time, you have a very awesome analogy that you did with your staff with the Postit Notes. Do you mind if I derail this episode a little bit and have you describe kind of what that is and what point you were trying to make to your staff in doing that Post-it note exercise?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So this has to do with concepts of lean in dentistry and what lean is all about. In the automotive industry, they came up with this. And it's about essentially avoiding wasted time. And so we have to look at, in a practice or any systematic procedure, when it's done, there'll oftentimes be bottlenecks that pop up. And those bottlenecks are where we tend to bump into wasted time. And the whole point of this is to realize that the dentist is the most important aspect of this whole procedure. And we have to keep the dentist productive, because if the dentist isn't fully productive, that's going to be the thing that's going to impact your production the most. And this analogy we did with the Post-it notes, I had a bunch of staff sitting around a table, and it was like an assembly line process. And we had these little stickers, and each staff's job was to put a sticker in a certain spot on the Post-it note and then pass it to the next staff member. And I had one of my staff members right in the middle of the line had a very complicated job. She had to cut the sticker in half and arrange it in a certain way and then take a pencil and draw a certain thing around it. And so her job took way longer than everybody else's job. And what we found out was that it didn't really matter. Everyone else's task paled in comparison to how efficient she was. And so as many Post-its as she could produce is as many as we got done in a certain time period. So she was the bottleneck in that whole process. And in our practice, I wanted the staff to realize that the dentist is the bottleneck. You know, if they're wasting my time during the day, that's going to throw us off schedule a lot more than if a patient takes longer at checkout, for example. That's not going to delay the whole day. And so what we did in this exercise was see how we could make this person's job easier. And so we delegated some of the tasks. We had someone cut the sticker for her. We had someone else draw the pencil thing, and we delegated as many things as we could. And we found out that the production drastically increased. It went from like 4 Post-it notes to like 30 Post-it notes in the same time period by kind of focusing on those things. And so it showed the staff, too, that they didn't necessarily have to work that much harder to be productive. But being productive is not all about just doing fast and going crazy, but it's about just, you know, being smart and not wasting time. Taking away wasted time is a lot more effective than just trying to do things faster.
Yeah, so it's reducing that limiting step, and then that'll ultimately lead to a much bigger yield.
Yeah, definitely.
And so then just kind of refresh the steps then, like for an office, to relate it back to the practice would be like check-in, seating the patient, you know, taking a preliminary impression or something like that if you're doing a crown, and then all those things to allow you to be in the room as little time as possible. Is that kind of what the point was?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, when I walk into a room, there's a couple scenarios, right? First scenario is that, let's say it's a crown prep, and I walk right in, patient's seated, ready to go, bib is on, topicals in place, preliminary impression's been taken, x-rays up on the screen. You know, I sit down, I talk to the patient for a minute or two. I always like to do that, kind of break the ice, but then we get working. You know, I can go right ahead and anesthetize and get to work. You know, and in another scenario where the scheduling is not correct, let's say they didn't dovetail the appointment and the patient only arrives right when I'm done with the patient before. And so now we have to wait for the patient to be seated. Maybe we need to take a new x-ray because the old x-ray wasn't adequate. You know, it's gonna waste about 10 minutes of my time at least. And, you know, multiply that over the course of a day, every patient. And, you know, a lot of times we have a practice that's wasting a good hour or 2 hours out of the day. And I heard this on Chris Griffin's podcast. He made an interesting statement. He talked about dentists taking vacation, and he said a lot of dentists take vacation 10 minutes at a time in their office. You know, just here and there, all this wasted time, and it adds up to, you know, weeks over the course of a year.
Absolutely. And then the other point that I think our listeners, it's great for them to realize is a lot of your expenses, you know, you're open a certain amount of hours, So, your expenses may be like $230 an hour, and to increase your hourly production, it may not cost you any additional expenses other than maybe your supplies and lab, but the impact on your profit is huge. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly.
Okay, so we kind of coming back to our scenario, we have talked about scheduling. So now I want to ask you some specific questions about this office. So this particular practice, it has one dental assistant, one office manager, and one hygienist. So at what point would you maybe add a staff member, and what staff member would you maybe add first?
Generally, my next thing to add would be another dental assistant because I like to work. If my schedule is productive, having two dental assistants makes a huge difference for me. If we're doing provider time scheduling, it allows the second assistant to seat the next patient in advance so that I can just go from one operatory to the next without a break there.
Would you do that immediately, or would you wait a little bit before bringing on that second assistant?
I'd probably get an assessment of how we're doing as far as scheduling goes, because let's say there's already openings throughout the day, and our limiting step in production is the number of patients that we're seeing or the procedures that we have case acceptance for. Then that's what we need to work on first. We need to work on marketing. We need to work on case acceptance and get those things down pat first so that we have the need to have a very efficient schedule.
Okay, so at what point, what would it look like in your office if you were acquiring this practice as a associate? And what would it look like when you were ready for that second dental assistant?
When I'm ready for that second dental assistant, generally I will have multiple times throughout the day where I feel the need for the second dental assistant. So like if I'm working in the operatory alone, let's say, and the other assistant is cleaning up the other operatory, or the assistant has to go do sterilization, a second dental assistant can pay for themselves quite easily just by relieving those 3 or 4 times a day that this happens. And I, as a dentist, am trying to do a prep by myself, and I'm holding the suction and doing the prep at the same time, and I'm waiting on the assistant for a minute to get that impression done. Those kind of things can really make a big difference. It also affects my satisfaction with being a dentist, right? It takes a lot more stress to work in that kind of environment versus where you have someone helping you throughout. So, yeah, for me, that's a big one. Is just noting kind of how many times throughout the day that we can use that second assistant. But I bring them on fairly quick, unless we're having major holes in the schedule that are pretty common.
Okay, so you've now, let's just say our dentist has come into the practice. They've now added that second dental assistant. What would you say would be the next staff member to add?
The next thing I would kind of look at would be hygiene. We have one hygienist here.
Okay.
I really, in my office, I've done assisted hygiene for several years now, and I really like that. I think it's a really good way to go. You have a very skilled and highly paid hygienist who I like to be able to let them focus on their unique abilities, right, which is cleaning teeth and patient education, patient relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so having an assistant and giving that hygienist 2 operatories, that hygienist can see a lot more patients in the day.
And is that about a 50% bump in their capacity?
In their capacity, this kind of depends on their ratio of new patients to recalls. But if you've got a day full of recalls, you can, it's about a 2/3 bump in their capacity.
Okay, so kind of average might be 40 to 50% then if you consider new patients and recall.
Yeah, I'd say at least 50%. I mean, for a recall, we take their hygiene time from 50 minutes down to 30 minutes. So, that it makes them, not quite double, but pretty close.
So then you would look at the hygiene schedule next, and you would see kind of how booked out are we, how busy are we, could we really use a hygiene assistant? And then you would bring a hygiene assistant in, and then this practice has 4 operatories. So can you talk about the layout? And then we have one that's unequipped. So if you could kind of talk about that and how that all fits in with your assisted hygiene plan.
Right. So if you go to assisted hygiene, that leaves you 2 operatories for hygiene and 2 for the doctor, which that works pretty well. Once you get to a certain point, having a 3rd operatory for the doctor is very helpful. So that unequipped op you'll have available to equip it when you need it.
And then what would that look like when you're ready to equip that 3rd doctor op?
That 3rd doctor op is great for assistant-only procedures. It's great for when, let's say you're just getting a little behind in your schedule and you want to seat that patient rather than make them wait out in the waiting room. So you got to be pretty busy to need that 3rd doctor op, but when you need it, it really comes in handy. For me, that's generally around maybe the $1 million production mark, just to give an idea.
And that's total office production?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so around the time that you hit $1 million, that 3rd op might be useful for the doctor.
Might be, yeah. And this depends on fees too. It depends on your procedure mix. I mean, if you're doing implants all day, $1 million is not a lot, and you're not actually that busy, so you may not need it. Now, if you're a PPO practice doing bread and butter, you're going to need that operatory much quicker.
And then with the 3rd operatory, are you a big same-day dentistry fan?
I like same-day dentistry. When you can do it, it's great. For my particular style of practice, it doesn't come in quite as heavy as with others because, we're doing some of the more bigger cases and focusing on those. I'm not going to put off my implant surgery to get a same-day occlusal filling out of hygiene, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to make that patient wait. But if that was some fillings I was doing for that patient, yeah, let's squeeze in this extra filling out of hygiene. It depends a little bit on your style, but same-day dentistry, as far as case acceptance is great, as far as the work for your office, because let's say, right, what's the chance of a no-show on a same-day accepted case, right?
Like almost 0%?
0%, right? They're there. They're going to do it. Your staff doesn't have to reschedule them. They don't have to confirm that they're coming. So there's a lot of real efficiency advantages with same-day dentistry.
I'm a huge same-day dentistry fan also, and one thing I've always wondered is, what is it that allows for more same-day dentistry? Is it the available operatory, the available staff, the excess doctor time? How do you, if you want to, let's just say this dentist has this practice and they want to do more same-day dentistry, is that incentive enough to equip that 3rd op, or is that not really a good reason?
It is a good reason. You need 3 things to make it work. You need staff available, right? Because you're not going to have time to go set up that room yourself. So you need an assistant who can do it. You need, obviously, a room available that someone's not sitting in or that's going to be needed within the next short period of time. And you need systems in place, too, so that you don't have to orchestrate this whole thing. If you've got to go up yourself to the front desk and say, hey, can you write up a financial agreement for this procedure? And then, tell the assistant, hey, we want to do this filling. I think room 3 is the best place to do it. Can you please set up for a filling? I'll need a handpiece. I'll need anesthesia. If you're doing all that, then your willingness and enthusiasm for same-day dentistry is going to go way down. But if you've got all this in place where you're just like, the hygienist knows, filling needs to be done, and automatically they're kind of putting the wheels in the gears in place to make it happen, and all you have to do is, imagine hearing from your staff, okay, Jimmy's seated in room 3 ready to go, and all you do is sit down and start doing the procedure, it's going to be a lot more easy.
Okay. I mentioned in a previous episode that one of our biggest issues right now as young dentists and dental students is our student loan debt. It is one of the main reasons why we strive at Shared Practices to navigate the path to successful practice ownership. We aim to help our audience by doing everything we can to help you earn a great income as a dentist. It has always been my advice to tackle your student loan debt by refinancing your loans after becoming a practice owner with a stable income. Doing this allows you to avoid paying too much on your monthly interest. The key to refinancing your loans is selecting an experienced lender that will offer you a competitive interest rate. Did you know that most student loans charge the same rate regardless of how creditworthy you are? So chances are, as dentists, you're probably paying too much in monthly interest. Laurel Road, a division of Darien Rowayton Bank, is a national leader in student lending. Laurel Road has helped medical professionals across the country refinance their federal and private dental school debt, saving thousands on interest over the life of their loans. Not only do they offer great terms and great service, ADA members receive an additional 0.25% rate discount on top of their new and already low rate for as long as they remain an ADA member. Fill out a 2-minute application and get pre-approved rates instantly if you are eligible. It's free to apply and there's no obligation to accept. For more information specific to your needs as a dentist and to submit an application, simply visit www.laurelroad.com/shared practices. Again, that is LaurelRoad.com/shared practices. Laurel Road is an equal housing and opportunity lender. All rates are subject to eligibility. Savings may vary. This is a paid promotion of student loan refinancing by Laurel Road. And so, kind of talking about hygiene with getting the wheels going, is co-diagnosis with hygiene something you would start sooner rather than later? Or is that something you would put off?
Oh, I think you should. That's a great thing to do very soon. I mean, if they don't have an intraoral camera in the operatory, I'd be buying that in the first month. Teaching them how to use it and letting them know, hey, anything that looks problematic, why don't we take a picture of it, show the patient, and let them know that doctor might have a concern with this. It makes my exam so much easier when the patient's kind of prepped for hearing something related to that tooth rather than just kind of, they're still kind of crossing their fingers that everything's going to be perfect and you've got to be the one to break the bad news. It makes your job a lot harder that way.
And just for our listeners, co-diagnosis is kind of the process of having a staff member, whether it's a hygienist or an assistant, pre-prep the patient for what would most likely be your diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let them see it, in a nice big picture, that big black spot on their tooth, right?
Exactly. And then one thing we talked about before was increasing the new patient flow as an attempt, to maybe get more busy and then have a need to be more efficient. So this practice that we have currently has 13 new patients per month, and its dentist to population ratio is 1,800 to 1. So looking at that, what would be your plans on, I know it's not favorable demographics, but it's not necessarily too terrible. What would be your plans to increase that new patient flow?
Yeah, so I think 13 is probably a little bit low considering this population ratio and the fact that they're involved with PPOs. I'd expect a higher new patient flow than that. Now, they are spending some money on advertising. When I saw this 13 new patient flow, I thought, oh, their marketing budget must be very low. But here they're spending 4%, so that's $25,000 a year. I'd look at what they're spending it on. Is this a legacy yellow page ad that might not be bringing in much? I'd be looking at putting a tracking number for sure on any kind of marketing, which, a lot of dentists don't do. But this tracking number, what it is, it's a unique phone number, different than your office number, and you track how many calls you get from it. And you can even record those calls to see about the quality of the patient that's calling in. You can see how well your staff is dealing with handling those calls. And so one of the big things with new patient flow is a lot of dentists don't realize they're missing a ton of phone calls. They may be generating, out of these 13 new patients, you might be getting 50 calls from this ad source. And you may be only answering 25 of those calls. And out of those 25, you may be only scheduling, say, 18. And then out of those 18, maybe only 13 are showing up. That's kind of how it goes. There's this whole funnel down there from the number of people that see your ad to the number of people that actually show up in your practice. And so each of those steps you want to really make sure that you're maximizing. So if you're missing a lot of calls, you got to figure out how to stop missing that many calls.
And then just a quick note, the national average for the missed call rate, I think, is like 35%. And then the average call conversion, so when that phone is answered, I think it's somewhere in the mid-40s. So that's just kind of the national average for those numbers, and that's kind of proving Graham's point where it does take so many phone calls to generate 13 new patients because of the inefficiency of that process.
Yep. Yep. It's very, in most practices, if they haven't devoted time to improving that's probably where they are, or even worse.
So what would you do to shore up the missed call rate and the call conversion?
Well, okay, with the tracking number, we want to know where we are, where we stand. Are we doing well, or are we not doing well? And it'll also give a little graph of. Now I use a program, a service called Call Tracker ROI, and they provide me every month with a graph of the calls, and it shows which hours most of the calls came, and so you can see where your missed calls are. You know, maybe you're getting a big peak of calls at 4 p.m. and between 4 and 5 p.m. when people are kind of finishing up with work, they're giving you a call. And let's say you close early on those days and you don't have anybody there to answer the phone. You have a couple choices. You can either ask your staff, ask one staff member to stay and cover the phones in your practice, or you can use a scheduling center, like a call center to take your calls and schedule the patients for you. Those are really the two best options I see.
Okay, so then you would see kind of where you're missing your calls. One other one that I heard was really big is the morning 9 to 12. Is that kind of what your experience is also? That's a high call volume time?
Yeah, early and late in the day. That's where most of the calls are going to be. Certainly lunchtime, a lot of practices, they close down for lunch and nobody's there to answer the phone at all. And I've never been a big fan of that.
Okay, so then having somebody maybe staggering your hours a little bit. It's kind of hard with this office with only one front desk, but, at least we identify the issue. And then the other thing is confirmation calls then. Would you move them to a time of day where there isn't as much call volume?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, let's free up the phones, when the calls are coming in the most. Same with, let's say you need to call insurance companies to deal with claims that aren't paid or, whatever. Do that in the middle of the day. It's a good idea.
Okay. So then is there anything else that, let's just say we've shored up all of these things. By the way, how much do you think this practice would have grown had you done all the things that we've mentioned?
Oh, I mean, average practice would probably double if everything was optimized. There's so many missed opportunities in most offices. It's just crazy.
Okay, so then what else would you be looking at that we maybe haven't touched on yet?
So training for handling those calls, too, is super important. So when you do answer the phone, is that scheduler knowing, do they have a process of guiding that patient towards scheduling the appointment? And they know that their goal is, okay, they have identified this is a new patient calling. My goal with this patient is to get them to schedule an appointment. A lot of dental staff don't even realize that. They just answer the phone and they kind of answer questions, and if the patient asks to schedule, they'll schedule them, but if not, okay, have a nice day. And so really training them on that, they could really bump up their number of patients that they schedule.
So then kind of to wrap up the phone, so the goals would be then like a 90% answer rate and then like a, like mid-70s, hot 80s, mid-80s of conversion? Is that kind of what you'd be looking at?
Yeah, that would be pretty good, I would say. Yep.
Okay. And so now I did want to kind of wrap up with you on one topic that you really affected my outlook on things with is you've done both startups and acquisitions, and you've kind of been able to me kind of blend the two together where they're not all that different. And I think for a lot of pre-owners listening, they seem like completely different routes and you pick one or the other. Can you kind of talk about that and how you like to think of startup versus acquisition? I think you offer a lot of value in that subject.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought the same way, when I first came out, that, you have these two stark contrasting choices. You either start a practice from scratch or you purchase a practice that is already, kind of whole. And that's how a lot of accountants view it. And that's why I thought of it that way. And that, when you buy a practice, and this is an important thing to do, but you look at the cash flow, right? And the kind of the assumption that accountants have to make is that the practice will kind of stay steady, right? You as a new owner, if it's producing $600,000, then it's going to produce $600,000 when you're the owner, and kind of in perpetuity. And that's never going to be the case. I mean, there's always going to be some changes because you're new, right? You're a different dentist than the old one. So it might be similar, or, you could grow the practice significantly. And, like we talked about here, George, where, this practice, even though nothing really stands out as crazy bad on paper, like there's probably a lot of missed opportunities. And the people listening to this podcast are going to be some of those dentists who are very on top of things and who are going to take these missed opportunities and capitalize on them. And so when I look at a practice that's for sale, I look at a lot of those weaknesses that, let's say this practice is doing $600,000, but my gosh, look at these demographics here. Look at the staff. They're not even answering the phone, and, they're not even keeping procedures in-house. This practice, I can probably step in the first year, make it $1 million practice, right? And there's a lot of practices out there that are like that. And so you can't just look at a $600,000 practice and say that's a $600,000 practice, right? The first $600,000 practice might be optimizing everything. They might be answering 90% of their calls, converting 80% of those calls that are answered. They're doing Invisalign, they're doing implants, they're keeping most of the endo in-house, and they just have a terrible demographics. And doing $600,000 in that demographic might be actually pretty good. Whereas, the other office should be doing a lot better than $600,000. They have a great demographics, and they're just kind of coasting along, right? And so before I buy a practice, I like to look into all those things and really see where the opportunity for improvement is. And that kind of goes along with the startup. When you're doing a startup, you really need to look at the local environment and your competition and kind of visualize where that practice is going to be in 5 years. Is this an environment where I can have a $1 million practice if that's my goal? With the acquisition, same thing. 5 years down the line, am I going to be able to turn this practice into my ultimate vision? So the only difference with an acquisition is that you have a little bit of a head start versus a startup.
And I think that right there, exactly what you just said, is really kind of what clicked when you were explaining that to me a couple years ago, is that an acquisition is nothing more than what was once a startup, just not a startup anymore. And then a startup a couple years in is now almost an existing practice the same way the acquisition is. And so I think kind of that, when you told me that, it made me think about things differently. And if our listeners, if they have listened to my episode with Richard, I go over kind of how I looked at and did my search for a dental practice. And I told you about it, Graham. And it's very heavily based on that concept that you kind of just broke down. I think it's so important for our listeners to realize that it's really what is going to be the practice you want 5 years from now, and not what is the best option for me today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one thing that I kind of didn't fully visualize, like when I bought my first practice. I kind of wish I had known that, because the demographics of the area weren't that great where I purchased my practice. And it was an awesome learning experience. I learned so much from being able to run that practice, and it was a great experience being able to grow it. So I don't have any regrets with it, but it didn't necessarily completely align with my long-term vision. In the new location where I am now, just the competitive environment is such that it's much more easy for me to realize my vision.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of leads us, right now we're in season 2, it's acquisitions, and then our next season is startups. And I think you offer great advice on, I think one thing you said on another podcast was pursue both at the same time, and then whatever kind of sees as the best situation is what you go for. Can you kind of go over that with our listeners?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So let's say, you're a dentist, you're just coming out of dental school, maybe you're an associate, and your goal is to be a practice owner. What can happen is we can kind of get really stovepiped into, okay, I want to acquire a practice, and that's all you're looking for. And the disadvantage of that approach is that you may not find a practice that is suitable for you, that's for sale, right? And same thing if you decide you're going to just do a startup. Right, there's a lot of barriers in the way to a startup. You may not be able to find a great demographics. You may find an area that has good demographics, but when you go to get a lease, you may find some issues with the landlord where they're not, giving you a favorable opportunity to sign a lease. And so I think it's good to keep both options in mind. And while you're pursuing an acquisition, also look at, hey, are there any areas here that are favorable for startup? I think everyone should do a demographics analysis of the whole area they live in. It's just good to have that understanding of, okay, to the west of me, there's some pockets of opportunity. To the north, it's very saturated. This is important to know whether you're doing an acquisition or a startup. So, do your homework in that. Understand where the best places are to go. And then, while you're looking for that acquisition, talk to some landlords and see if there's some spaces for startups too. I think either way you can be, very successful if you take the right approaches. And so, that's one of the things I love about what you're doing, George, is you're kind of laying all this out for everybody. Hey, here are the steps you need to take, whether it's a startup, whether it's an acquisition, to be a successful owner. There's no like one cookie cutter way of saying, hey, you have to acquire a practice. That's the best way to be successful. Like, no, both options can work very well as long as you're well educated and willing to work at it.
Yeah, I don't think I could have said that better myself, even if I tried. And, I think you're kind of the perfect guy to bridge us from Season 2, the acquisitions, and where Graham's agreed to come back on for Season 3 and startups, an area he has a lot of experience in. And so I really appreciate your time, Graham. I think our listeners definitely got their hour's worth of content here, so I really do appreciate it.
Oh, sure, George. Hey, anytime. Happy to come on.
All right.
Okay, so welcome back. I love it when people on our show talk about like doubling the practice. Like that's something that Derek Williams just did. He's just like, oh yeah, we just came in and we doubled the practice. Graham Dersley, oh yeah, let's double the practice. So you can kind of see when people know there's an opportunity on the table and they really take advantage of it. That's the kind of guest that we like having on our show.
Yeah, and I think Graham is the kind of guy that's grown a practice 5 times, 6 times its original size. And so for him, it was striking to me when he so casually said, oh yeah, probably double. Yeah, maybe double the size.
Yeah.
Easy.
No problem. Yeah, easy. If only for everyone. Well, and so what were the things that you feel like that make it easy for him? And what are the key takeaways from Graham?
Yeah, I have 3 pointed out that I think I should talk about. And the first, I think front desk efficiency in terms of new patient conversions, so that both the missed call rate and the call conversion on those, I think that's huge because those are people that are calling your practice that can be converted to new patients at no additional cost to you. And so that's huge. So that was my first one. My second one was scheduling. I think that's something Graham does very well. Is his scheduling philosophy. I know he uses provider time scheduling. And I think scheduling efficiently can be huge for your overall efficiency and production. And then case acceptance. I think that might be the biggest one, would be your ability to relate information to patients.
And that's something, we've been talking about Season 3, which we're going to do startups. So that's going to be coming up here pretty soon. In fact, this is second to last episode of Season 2. But after that, we were bouncing around ideas and in improving case acceptance and financial arrangements and treatment plan presentation. That's one of the ideas that we really want to hit in Season 4. So it's going to be a little while, but I think that's somewhere that all of us can improve upon. So I think we're going to have a lot of really good content surrounding that idea of improving case acceptance.
Oh, yeah. And I think, as we go through the seasons, we're going to try to hit on the things initially that will give you the biggest return on your time invested.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely the big one is, I think, case acceptance and patient communication. So we're going to try to hit that one early after Season 3. But speaking of Season 3, I think Graham will be a great guest for the season.
Sure.
We haven't recorded that episode yet, so I don't want to say it's in stone, but he agreed to it a year ago, so we'll make sure that we hold him to that.
Awesome. Well, and if you are kind of in that final stages of acquiring a practice, this is a perfect episode to come back and listen to and just kind of have your game plan, build a game plan for what are the first steps you're gonna take. So this was an awesome episode. Thanks for getting Graham on, George.
No problem. I really enjoyed it. And then for the Season 2 wrap-up coming up next time, tune in to the Shared Practices podcast.